General Hospital spoilers reveal that Willow was no longer the fragile woman people once believed they could push aside, silence, or manipulate. She was becoming something sharper, colder, forged out of desperation and the unbearable ache of losing control over the children who had defined the last years of her life. In the aftermath of Drew's devastating stroke, when the world should have collapsed beneath her feet, something inside Willow hardened instead. A quiet yet relentless shift from grief to strategy, from helplessness to a fierce determination that bordered on obsession. Every breath she took, every hesitant step she forced herself to make in the hospital corridors, every hour of sleepless calculation slowly rebuilt her into a version of herself she had never allowed to exist, a woman prepared to break the rules, bend morality, and reshape the world around her if that was the price of reclaiming Wiley and Amelia. And as she drew strength from her pain, she discovered a new axis of leverage, Scout and Danny. It was almost ironic how the situation unfolded, how effortlessly Alexis had handed Willow the perfect angle without ever realizing it. The moment Alexis asked for permission for Danny to see Scout, the shift became real, tangible. A tightening of invisible strings that Willow instantly recognized for what they were. She had influence. She had something people wanted. And in her current state, she had no intention of letting anyone else dictate the terms. What began as a single request subtly transformed into a silent war of psychological positioning. Willow understood that Alexis's calm demeanor was nothing more than a mask, barely holding together her anxiety about Scout's emotional stability, her need to protect the children left in her care, and her desire to maintain moral authority while everything around her seemed to fracture. For the first time in a long while, Willow saw someone else living in the very instability she herself had been trapped in: uncertainty, fear, and the pressure of decisions that could shatter a family. And she realized she could use it. She knew exactly how deeply Danny missed Scout, how much the children's bond meant to Alexis, how fragile the circumstances were after weeks of emotional turbulence. The more Willow observed, the more she began to sense the tremor behind Alexis's controlled voice, the hesitation before every sentence, the flicker of worry in her eyes whenever Willow reminded her that nothing would move forward without her approval. It was a power Willow had never experienced before, a power she did not seek but could not ignore, one that grew stronger each time she delayed an answer, each time she hinted that conditions could be discussed at a later date, each time she forced Alexis to wait. And what made it even more potent was that Willow's motive was not cruelty, it was survival. She believed, with absolute conviction, that reclaiming her place in Wiley and Amelia's lives required leverage, positioning, and unwavering resolve. If she backed down even once, if she showed softness, if she allowed Alexis to maneuver her emotionally the way so many others had in the past, she would lose everything. So she held firm. She tightened the reins a little more each day. Privately, she began mapping out the legal paths she could take, the emotional angles she could exploit, and the psychological pressure points that were already beginning to show cracks in those around her. The instability brewing between Alexis and the situation with Danny and Scout could work to her advantage, creating a landscape where Willow appeared to be the only one thinking clearly, the only one acting with purpose, the only one capable of making rational decisions concerning the emotional welfare of children. And with every passing moment, Willow felt herself stepping deeper into that role. It was no longer just about getting Wiley and Amelia back, it was about reclaiming autonomy, reclaiming identity, reclaiming the right to shape the future instead of merely reacting to it. Her internal transformation frightened some, especially Alexis, who slowly began to sense that Willow's grief had twisted into something unpredictable, something dangerous, something that didn't follow the expected arc of healing. Instead of softening, Willow sharpened. Instead of breaking, she reassembled herself into something more complex and unsettling. The more Alexis tried to maintain balance, the more Willow pulled the ground out from under her without ever raising her voice or making a direct threat. It was the quietness of Willow's approach that made it unnerving, the calm precision with which she set new boundaries. Scout's visit would have to wait until Willow had secured a path toward reunifying with Wiley and Amelia. Communication would only proceed on her timeline. Emotional appeals would be dismissed with polite distance. Any sense of urgency Alexis expressed would be met with thoughtful silence. That forced her to sit with her own growing dread. Alexis started losing sleep, replaying every word she exchanged with Willow. Terrified of saying the wrong thing, terrified of pushing too hard, terrified of being shut out entirely. And as the tension deepened, the impact began to ripple outward. Denny felt it. Scout felt it. Even the air around the Quartermains shifted, uncertainty bleeding into every interaction. Everyone aware that Willow's choices were starting to generate consequences. None of them could predict, but the truth was far more alarming than any of them understood. Because Willow herself was no longer operating from the emotional framework they assumed. She wasn't driven by panic anymore, she was driven by calculation. She wasn't pleading for permission, she was asserting control. She wasn't trying to restore harmony, she was weaponizing imbalance. And the more she pushed, the more she discovered that she could. The power dynamics of her world, once tilted so far against her, were now responding to her slightest movements, reshaping themselves around her will. And as she pushed further, the edges of her reasoning began to blur, not into madness, but into a version of determination so intense it bordered on obsession. She would get Wiley back. She would get Amelia back. She would reclaim the life unfairly stripped from her, even if the path required pressure, manipulation, or emotional warfare. Even if Alexis crumbled beneath the strain. Even if Scout and Danny became pieces in a larger game. Willow wasn't losing control, she was taking it. And the unsettling truth was that she was starting to like the way it felt. Wiley was no longer the quiet, conflicted child caught helplessly in the emotional storms swirling around him. He was reaching a breaking point, and the weight of everything Willow had been doing was beginning to twist itself into something sharp, something ugly, something he could no longer swallow in silence. The disgust he felt toward her was not the simple, fleeting anger of a child, it was deeper, heavier, shaped by betrayal, shaped by fear, shaped by the unsettling realization that the woman who kept insisting she loved him was also the same woman weaponizing children, controlling emotions, and twisting circumstances to force the world to bend to her will. For Wiley, who understood far more than any adult wanted to admit, the shift inside him had become impossible to hide. And when he finally began to express it publicly, loudly, fearlessly, it sent ripples of panic through every single person watching the situation unfold. Willow had expected resistance from Alexis, hesitation from Michael, or even suspicion from Monica, but she had never accounted for the possibility that Wiley himself would be the one to stand against her. She had believed, perhaps too confidently, that her son would always see her pain before her flaws, her effort before her manipulation, but she underestimated how deeply children perceive truth, how instinctively they recoil when something feels wrong, unstable, or threatening. And now, with every cold look Wiley cast at her, with every flinch when she reached out to touch his shoulder, with every sentence he uttered that carried the quiet tremor of disappointment, Willow felt something far more terrifying than opposition. She felt her entire strategy beginning to fracture. The turning point came on a morning that should have been uneventful. Willow had arrived ready to run another one of her calculated plays, something subtle, something that would keep upper hand over Alexis and pressure her into further concessions. But when Wiley saw her, he didn't smile, didn't run toward her, didn't show even the soft confusion she had grown used to. Instead, he stared at her with an intensity far beyond his years of cold, unwavering gaze that felt like an accusation Willow could not escape. And then, for the first time, he spoke against her, not in private, not in uncertainty, but in a way that made the entire room fall silent. He told her she was being cruel, that she was hurting people who didn't deserve it, that Scout was scared, that Danny cried because he couldn't understand why he wasn't allowed to see his sister, that he couldn't understand why Willow, the person who claimed to protect children, was now the one causing so much pain. His words hit harder than any legal threat, any confrontation with Alexis, any strategic countermove. They weren't delivered with anger, they were delivered with clarity. The clarity of a child who has finally recognized the difference between love and control. And then came the part that truly shattered what Willow had built. Wiley demanded that she allow Scout and Danny to see each other again. Not suggested, not negotiated. He demanded. He told her directly, in front of everyone, that if she truly cared about him, about any of them, she would stop using the children as bargaining chips. He told her that if she didn't allow Scout and Danny to meet, he would no longer trust anything she said, that he would no longer believe she acted out of love, that he would no longer see her the same way. It was a moment that stole the breath from every adult in the room, because Wiley's words were not simply the frustrations of a child, they were a moral verdict, a condemnation that exposed everything Willow had tried to hide beneath layers of grief, trauma, and calculated manipulation. And for Willow, who had spent weeks constructing a psychological battlefield she believed she was winning, this was the one blow she had no defense for, because Wiley, unlike the adults she sparred with, could not be intimidated, could not be negotiated with, could not be pressured. He spoke from a place Willow could not touch: innocence. It made her strategy not only look ruthless, but monstrous. It painted her actions in the harshest light possible. And worst of all, it made her realize that she was losing the one person she thought she could still salvage everything for. Meanwhile, Wiley's public condemnation ignited a shift far beyond Willow's immediate world. Suddenly, Alexis no longer needed to argue. Wiley had given voice to every fear she had swallowed. Michael felt something twist inside him, torn between protecting Willow's mental unraveling and protecting their son's psychological stability. Even Danny, emboldened by Wiley's stance, began to speak up more fiercely for Scout, declaring loudly that Willow had no right to separate siblings just because she was angry at the world. And Scout, watching everything with wide, frightened eyes, clung to Danny as if afraid she might be taken next. Willow's authority, so carefully constructed, began to crumble. Her control slipped like water through her fingers. And with every word Wiley repeated to anyone who would listen, "She's hurting us. She's making everything worse. She won't let Scout see Danny. She won't listen to anyone." The narrative began to change. Suddenly, Willow wasn't the grieving partner fighting for her children. She wasn't the mother clawing her way back after a devastating tragedy. She was becoming the threat, the destabilizing force, the source of emotional harm. And the more Wiley spoke, the more credible everyone found his perspective, because children don't lie about pain, and they don't fabricate fear. Willow's entire plan, once built on careful timing and subtle manipulation, now faced a new and unpredictable danger, the truth coming from the one mouth she never expected to turn against her. And this wasn't just a setback, it was a catastrophe, because if the court caught wind of Wiley's statements, if a judge heard that Willow was intentionally blocking sibling contact, if professionals began questioning her emotional stability, everything she had been building could collapse in a single day. The shock of Wiley's rebellion ricocheted through her entire world, tearing open every vulnerability she had tried to conceal. And in that moment, for the first time since Drew's collapse, Willow felt something she couldn't control, couldn't outrun, couldn't negotiate away: fear. Real fear. Because she wasn't just losing leverage, she was losing her son's respect, his trust, his love. And if she lost that, then everything she fought for, everything she sacrificed, everything she manipulated, every line she crossed would mean nothing. The disaster was here, and it was only beginning. Willow had begun to transform Drew's tragedy into a force far more powerful than sympathy or grief. She was using it as a weapon, a shield, a justification for reshaping every boundary and every relationship surrounding the children in her orbit. What started as quiet heartbreak had become a strategic recalibration of her entire life, a psychological tightening of control disguised beneath trembling hands and glassy eyes. People saw fragility, but beneath that fragile shell, something far more dangerous was taking form. A woman who believed trauma granted her the right to redefine morality, to seize advantage wherever it surfaced, to claim sacrifices from others even when those sacrifices came at the cost of the innocent. She learned to invoke Drew's condition with impeccable timing, weaving it into conversations with Alexis, letting it hang heavily in the air whenever she needed leverage, ensuring that any pushback against her could be framed as heartlessness. The hospital staff whispered about her resilience, the quartermains whispered about her pain, but only a few Lexus among them began to sense the chilling truth, that the narrative surrounding Drew had shifted from tragedy to strategy. The more Willow realized people hesitated to confront her, the more she expanded her reach, reshaping decisions around Wiley, Amelia, Scout, and even Danny through emotional pressure that no one initially recognized as manipulation. She no longer asked, she implied. She no longer requested, she positioned. She no longer pleaded, she controlled the emotional landscape so thoroughly that others stumbled around her, afraid of triggering her grief, afraid of saying no. And in the shadows of that unspoken influence, Willow began constructing her next phase, using Drew's sacrifice, as she framed it, to justify reclaiming every piece of her life she felt had been taken from her. But with each step she took, Alexis felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She could see the signs others refused to acknowledge, the way Willow's tone hardened when discussing custody arrangements, the subtle ways she isolated Scout, the strange rigidity in her voice whenever siblings were mentioned, and the chilling glimmer of certainty in her eyes when she spoke about her rights, as if they were divine entitlements rather than legal responsibilities. Alexis had always been sharp, always aware of dangerous shifts in emotional behavior, and she now recognized that Willow was standing at the edge of a psychological transformation that could devastate every child involved. The more Willow used Drew's situation to fortify her position, the clearer it became that she was not acting from love anymore. She was acting from fear, from desperation, and from an emerging sense of power that distorted her judgment. The moment Alexis realized that Willow had begun restricting Scout's interactions, purely for leverage not safety, she felt something cold and instinctual rise inside her. The responsibility to intervene before the children became casualties of Willow's unraveling. For the first time in months, Alexis allowed herself to envision a future where she regained full custody of Scout, not because she wanted to confront Willow, but because Willow's emotional instability had crossed into territory that endangered the child's mental and emotional well-being. Yet Alexis also understood the cost of this path. A custody war with someone spiraling like Willow could become catastrophic, but the alternative, doing nothing, was far worse. And what truly tipped the balance was Wiley. The boy had always been sensitive, empathetic, intuitive beyond his years, but now he was responding not from innocence, but from lived experience. He had watched Willow deny Danny any contact with Scout. He had watched her turn simple decisions into power plays. He had watched her speak about family while breaking the very bonds she claimed to protect. And something inside Wiley snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. His revulsion toward Willow wasn't a childish tantrum, it was the profound disappointment of a child, forced to witness the moral collapse of someone who once meant everything to him. He began speaking up in front of adults, openly declaring that Willow was hurting people, that she was using Drew's suffering to excuse her behavior, that she was making rules that didn't feel fair or kind. And when he told Michael he didn't want to be part of Willow's manipulation, it revealed a depth of understanding no one expected him to possess. He even told Alexis, with trembling determination, that he was willing to accept whatever emotional consequences came his way, if it meant protecting his father from Willow's spiraling influence. Wiley's willingness to sacrifice his own comfort to shield Michael was both heroic and heartbreaking. It exposed the emotional violence of the situation with a purity no adult could refute. His voice became the loudest alarm bell of all, because children do not craft illusions, do not strategize, do not exaggerate pain for control. When a child rejects a parent's behavior, it marks a rupture so deep that even the strongest denial cannot conceal it. And Willow felt that rupture like a blade tearing straight through her carefully constructed plans. She had never imagined that Wiley might oppose her openly, that he might reject her narrative, that he might expose her behavior in a way she could not silence, soften, or spin. His condemnation caused cracks in her strategy that spread faster than she could contain them. If the courts learned that Wiley felt unsafe, controlled, or emotionally manipulated, if evidentiary reports captured his statements about her restricting sibling contact, if professionals observed her exploiting Drew's condition as justification for unstable parenting, her entire custody bid would collapse. But instead of reevaluating her actions, Willow doubled down. She insisted the children were confused, manipulated by others, unable to understand the pressures she faced. She dismissed Wiley's words as emotional outbursts, believing she could still regain control by tightening her grip further. What she failed to grasp was that the people she once could silence were no longer afraid to speak. Alexis had already begun documenting every change, every escalation. Every moment Scout appeared distressed by Willow's decisions. Michael, torn between guilt and paternal instinct, was beginning to recognize patterns he had once refused to see. Patterns resembling behaviors he had witnessed in other unstable figures throughout his life. Even Danny, encouraged by Wiley's courage, spoke with newfound boldness about the injustice of being separated from his sister. And in the center of this unraveling storm, Willow continued to push blindly, believing she was gaining strength when in fact she was losing every anchor that once grounded her. The greatest tragedy was not what Willow was doing, it was what she refused to see. She believed she was reclaiming power, when in truth she was isolating herself. She believed she was protecting her children, when in truth she was driving them away. She believed Drew's suffering elevated her moral authority, when in truth it exposed her willingness to exploit pain as currency. And as the tension intensified, the path forward became terrifyingly clear. Alexis was preparing to petition for full custody of Scout. Wiley was ready to accept emotional damage if it meant protecting Michael. Michael himself was nearing a breaking point, and Willow stood unaware at the center of it all, about to be blindsided by a consequence she never imagined. She would face the collapse of everything she fought to regain. The shock was coming. It was inevitable. And when it hit, Willow would finally confront the truth she had refused to acknowledge, that power built on grief, fear, and manipulation does not protect a family. It destroys it.